Hello, I'm Jim Falk, and welcome to Perspectives Matter. Today we're going to be talking about sanctions, now a favorite tool for the United States to use against adversaries such as Russia, Iran, North Korea, and frankly, countless other countries and individuals. Joining us remotely are two experts who share a deep knowledge on this subject. Bruce Gentleson is coming to us from Duke University, where he's a professor of public policy, and he's the author of Sanctions, What Everyone Needs to Know. Additionally, he's a global fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center. He served in policy positions at the Department of State in both the Clinton and the Obama administrations. And joining us from the American Enterprise Institute is Leon Aron. Born in Moscow, Dr. Aron came to the United States as a refugee in 1978. He's the author of 4 books and hundreds of articles and essays about the Gorbachev-Yeltsin Revolution and post-Soviet Russia. His latest book, Riding the Tiger, Vladimir's Putin's Russia and the Uses of War, is really an astute analysis of how the Russian president has maintained his iron grip on power and Russia's road to the current war on Ukraine. What are sanctions, and what are the different forms of sanctions?
Yeah, sanctions are the use of economic relationships and instruments for political, strategic, military, diplomatic objectives. So with trade, you have embargoes where you refuse to export certain goods you have, like oil, for example, to a targeted country. A boycott, you refuse to buy in. You can do it with foreign aid. You can do it with finance that's using the American dollar because it's such a common currency for international trade is often used as well. You could do it with sports. South Africa in the 1980s, in the anti-apartheid sanctions, was banned from World Rugby and others that had a big impact on them, not just the economics. Do it cultural events and the like. So it's using those instruments, and it's not a trade negotiation where it's just you want a concession on a tariff or something. It's really when your objectives are more in the political and strategic domain.
Leon, were we using sanctions prior to the Cold War against the Soviet Union? And if so, what were they?
Yes, there was so-called COCOM, which was an agency that looked at exports from the West to the Soviet Union. Um, it's hard to say how effective they were simply because the Soviet Union, by definition, was an autarky, and so they were not particularly connected with the West until the 70s, of course, when they discovered that they could essentially buy bread with oil, and so it's hard to say how effective they were because they were rather limited. You may remember, I'm showing my age. I was a student at Columbia at the time, where I think in his first year in power, Ronald Reagan tried to stop the export of wide diameter pipes to the Soviet Union so that they could not effectively deploy their oil. And we tried to persuade, I think rather unsuccessfully, some of our top allies. It's different now because until this war, Russia had integrated itself rather deeply in the world economy, and so we could actually track now what works and what doesn't.
How many sanctions, Bruce, are there now against Russia? I heard over 16,000. Is that true?
Yeah, it depends how you count, whether you count by product. But I think the thing is, these are the most extensive international sanctions, multilateral sanctions, other than those that have been authorized by the UN Security Council. Like against South Africa and at certain stages against Iran. It's been more mixed, but I would say that you've gotten more companies cooperating with these than you have, for example, with sanctions against China, because the economic interests at stake in China, whether it's human rights of the Uyghurs or other issues, are much greater. So you see, in some respects, an interesting contrast between what companies have done towards Russia. Hasn't been perfect, but it's been more than in other cases than what they've done with China, much less.
Leon, do you see it that way? And also, I'm wondering about Germany, because Germany has had such close ties, economic ties to Russia.
One of the most annoying situations here, in addition to the countries that your other guest mentioned, is Turkey. It's a NATO ally, and yet, along with China and Central Asian countries, it's the major conduit for sanctioned products, technology, dual-use technology, particularly semiconductor chips, and things like that could be used directly in Russian ammunition or in targeting, go through Turkey. So that's one thing. There's in terms of who left and how. The Russians had a bit of a quandary as to how to rename about 200 to 300 McDonald's in Russia. And in the end, they've come up with something like "Вкусно и точка." It tastes well and fine. So this is now a new title for over the McDonald's, and some of the Russian wits now apply that to the fact that virtually all the key automakers left, Audi, Mercedes, all of that, and it's now entirely either China or back to essentially the Soviet prototypes, the tiny Ladas and so on and so forth. So a play on the new McDonald title is "It moves and that's fine." So that's the slogan of the Russian auto industry at the moment.
So one area where it seems that it's really is working, where the sanctions are working, is in civil aviation and maybe military as well. But I think I read in one of your articles, Leon, just how large, how many planes are grounded in Russia.
Yeah, so far, fortunately, no lethal accidents, but the percentage of accidents, either at the takeoff or at landing, went exponentially up, and that is because over 3/4 of Russian civil aviation were leased from Western companies and maintained by them. They pulled out, and so the question is where to get the spare parts, and more importantly, how to train Russian mechanics to put them in. And so far, it's not going very well.
I get that India is an important ally of the United States, but I still don't get why we're not putting a lot more pressure on Russia's economy by encouraging some way or another for India not to be purchasing that much oil. Leon?
At a huge discount, and so is China, of course. But of late, I think India started to wobble. I think in part because of the pressure from us, in part because Russia would not take rupees and tea for the payment. And the Russians like tea. I grew up drinking a lot of tea, but we don't need that much tea. And so the I think India is now looking more and more to the United Emirates and Saudi Arabia. So that if that happens, that would be good news.
That's positive. Okay. It's really hard for us to have the knowledge that you have, and you've written about this, because what we read is that Russia's economy is strong. I heard that its GDP is forecast for this year to be stronger than France, the UK, and the United States. And yet you've written major pieces in the Wall Street Journal saying that the sanctions are taking effect. I don't see it yet.
Jeff, I think it's useful. The expectation of the sanctions for many people was like a nuclear bomb. You deploy it, it explodes the Russian economy. I prefer it a little bit more elaborate, something like two hoses, two oxygen hoses going into the body of the Russian economy and society. One with the profits from gas and oil, and the other with technologies, especially dual-use technologies. But also, consumer goods. Russia is very bad in producing quality consumer goods. It always bought them from the West or from the South. So we are not constrained. We are not blocking these hoses, but we are stepping on them increasingly with an increasingly leaden foot. And we are slowly degrading the Russian society, and most importantly, a Russian economy and Russian finance. For example, they pay much more for a number of things that they used to get. And so, as far as the GDP, indeed, the thing here is very simple, I think. Russia, through trillions of rubles, which is hundreds of billions of dollars, from various sources, including their rainy day national welfare fund, into the military-industrial complex. And that counts as the GDP and the tanks and the cannons and everything else, and enormous salaries for the soldiers. And yes, the GDP is up, but also is the inflation, because as Elvira Nabiullina, who is the head of the Russian central bank, and who really tends to speak truth every now and then, pointed out that the military-industrial complex is bleeding the civilian economy dry, both in terms of labor, because the salaries are much higher, and even draft. And so you have inflation because the country, the economy cannot safely digest those trillions of dollars. We have 7.5% inflation officially. Nabiullina raised the prime rate. How about that, to 16.5%? Astronomical by any standards. But what the Russian economists are saying is that while the average is 7.5, the staples, eggs, butter, sugar, and some others that are purchased by those below the median income, which is about $300 to $400 a month, that inflation is about 24%. So this is a double-edged sword. You could jump up the GDP, but you also have to look at the unintended consequences.
But Bruce, talk about how sanctions are often designed to go to the people, to have them put pressure on their government, because that is one of the goals, right?
Yeah, it is. And that's the dilemma. The economic damage is there, as Leon was saying. But that damage is a means to the ends of putting sufficient pressure on Russia to at least bring them to the negotiating table to end this war in a way that serves Ukrainian interests, American interests, and the rest of the world. That's not happening. And before the sanctions, the language from the president and others was devastating. Send them to the dark ages, and the like. And so I think yes, the long-term effect on the Russian economy is significant. They've lost a lot of techies who've just left the country and gone to other countries and the like. But right now, the crucial goal of the sanctions is to help the overall war effort. And the clock seems to be ticking a little bit on that in terms of American support, European support, the battle lines and stuff. So you want to hit what you can think of as transmission belts and not circuit breakers, right? Mm-hmm. If the economic impact is borne by groups in the country that have interests aligned, say, with Putin, they're a circuit breaker. They stop them going in. You want to hit those transmission belts where they carry it into their own version of a political process. And so the problem here is we're kind of in a war of attrition economically, and the impact, is not as much as seems to be needed. You keep the sanctions on, but it's a balancing act with the war effort. And that's the goal here, not just what the statistics are in terms of economic damage.
So, Leon, I read this good book, you may have heard of it, called Riding the Tiger, and your book, of course. And in it, you talk about how Putin has now requiring training for people as young as 5th grade, become much more militaristic. Patriotism, greater Russia is all part of the messaging. And so it makes me think that the Russian citizen is and has become increasingly resilient to the pressure that we're trying to put on them.
Some of the Russians, rather courageous, I'd say, political sociologists such as Volkov or Alexei Levinson, estimate that 12 to 13% are resolutely against the war. Incidentally, we saw that there was one candidate in this fake election that Putin held. I call it self-coronation. He held it in March, and there was one candidate that was allowed to run on an explicitly anti-war platform. I think this was rather cute of the Kremlin, because they knew, of course, that they'll never allow him to run. But as he was collecting signatures, they thought, I think the idea was, the polls are polls, and everybody tells us everything is fine, but let's test it in vivo as opposed to in vitro. And within a few weeks, he collected over 100,000 signatures. People were lining up on the street to put their signatures to the candidacy that they knew was not going to allow to be going forward. So also the funeral of the leading Russian
Navalny,
opponent of the regime, Alexei Navalny, who was slowly murdered in jail. Thousands turned out while they were filmed by FSB and other secret services. This shows that the society is not as homogeneous as Putin would like us to believe. But again, Jim, I mean, I wrote another book about the magnificent, explosion of truth that doomed the Soviet Union. It was called Roads to the Temple. Suddenly, within literally 2 years, as soon as people could get access to alternative sources, as soon as the propaganda stopped, and as soon as the censorship was lifted, it completely changed people's minds. So who knows? What I called in the book militarized patriotism appears to be successful on the surface, and certainly, it's okay for Putin, because he does not want, some passionate cooperation. He wants conformity. He wants deference. And so far he has it, except for the cases, for example, as the mothers and the wives of the mobilized reservists.
So when you go back in time and you look at Afghanistan and Gorbachev, what sanctions did we use then against Russia, Bruce? And were those effective? I don't think so. It was more the mothers and pressure on Gorbachev, and Gorbachev was very different. But how do you see it?
Yeah, I think then you get into the diplomacy. Sanctions they're never the whole strategy. To the extent you use them, they have to be paired with a diplomatic strategy. And I think Afghanistan was very much, Gorbachev deciding this was not in Russia's interest, not because of sanctions per se, but it was, an open wound bleeding the country. And his overall goals, perestroika and the like, that was a whole era in which, we were finding common ground with them. And it was really more the efforts to get there and then turn some of the sanctions into economic relationships over time, some of which started to happen and some of which got short-circuited by the coup against Gorbachev.
Do you see, are there sanctions that we could now put in place against Russia or its citizens that we've not done that might help? Leon,
every
or
week
Bruce, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Every week you get more sanctions. There were some in the news just the other day about these complicated financial transactions, which first we imposed sanctions on Chinese banks that we knew about for providing credit for Russia to, import things from China and from elsewhere in the world. And now it's it's moved over to some regional banks in China. And it's a little bit like squeezing the pillow. This question of alternative trade partners and the options that the target has. That's that offense-defense balance. And you feel like even with all the sanctions we've imposed, there's one more loophole after another we're trying to enforce. And, I'll use the term creative, and I don't mean in a positive sense, but people who sanctions bust and countries and others can be very, very creative in how they do it. I don't think there's any magic sanction that's going to turn the tide. I think Leon's right. There's a cumulative effect there, but it's been less than we thought. And I think it's taken longer than we thought. And so the question now, I think, as I look at 2024, is really more the balance on the ground. Can you maintain the military balance in ways, that stops Russia from moving ahead and both gains ground from the Ukrainians and demoralizes them, in ways that you can still try to bring economic pressure. But I really worry about that clock ticking on this strategy.
Well, the relationship between Russia and China seems to be very difficult to discern right now, and there's probably a lot more daylight today than there was a year or two ago. But Leon, do you see that China is helping Russia bust some of these sanctions, or not?
It's a very interesting question. One of the things that we forget, Jim, is that Xi Jinping is a fervent Marxist. He spoke at the Grand Hall of People. That would be almost 6 years ago on Marxist 200th anniversary of Marx's birth, and he called him the greatest man who ever lived. He is a Marxist, and I think for him, there's no love lost. I've written about this between Russia and China. I mean, they've been at each other for centuries. Let's not forget they fought a rather short but bloody war in 1969 on the Ussuri River, and so I don't think there's any particular love between the two. But Putin needs China for obvious reasons. Some call Russia now China's gas station, which is probably true. For Xi Jinping, I think it's part of the overall sort of struggle against the imperialist capitalist West. And just as Lenin did it in after World War One, and as Stalin did it after World War Two with the conquest of Eastern Europe, my sense is that Xi Jinping supports Russia in part because he feels that it's draining the West, and it is yet another positive blow against the capitalist West. So I think this is part of it that tends to elude us. One more thing on the sanctions, as Bruce mentioned, the so-called secondary sanctions that we were developing and should develop much more.
And explain what that means.
Well, that means that it's not enough to sanction, for example, a particular firm that we caught red-handed delivering, say, machine tools, which is a big deal, programmable digital machine tools to Russia, so it could make pretty much everything in their military. We have to go to those who make it. And recently there was some astounding data on this, Jim. Most of those machine tools are made in France, United States, Germany, and the Czech Republic. And those firms sell it to, they don't, as you know, the way it works, they sell it to a middleman. And the middleman they would sign anything to say that, no, this is not going to Russia. Then they sell it to another middleman, usually, by the way, in Hong Kong. And from there, it just dissipates. And probably through Kazakhstan or Tajikistan, it goes into Russia. So those are the sanctions that we have to fine tune and really burrow into.
Bruce, how well do we do in the United States about monitoring sanctions?
We do pretty well. Treasury Department is really the lead in some of these, and the intelligence agencies. And other countries do too. I was actually in the UK in January at a conference called by the Home Office, by the British Foreign Ministry, because they've really been working on their own in increasing their enforcement. They do have a number of issues there. So-called Londonstan, which was a nice parking place for oligarchs' money and the like. But again, it's the same question we face about drug cartels and international crime. It's this really complicated game of trying to find out on the monitoring and the enforcement. And then you do need other countries to support, because the secondary sanctions are not just against others in the supply chain. In a lot of cases, you're telling other countries that have not agreed to the same sanctions as we have, maybe some but less, that they need on an extraterritorial basis, that is, our law applies to their territory, to abide by ours. And that can cause a lot of friction. There's a reference earlier to Margaret Thatcher, back with Ronald Reagan, who agreed with him on much everything. But when he tried to do that on the gas pipeline sanctions, even she kind of got her back up about British sovereignty. So it's a really tricky business, this level of enforcement and monitoring.
And what we've seen is that sanctions are easy to put in place, but sometimes hard to lift. And I suspect with Russia, in as we move towards hopefully some type of settlement, there's going to be a lot of tension about how to ease up on sanctions. Don't you think, Leon?
Oh, Jim, it's been news to me to find out that for all the beating of the chest by Europe, they 16% of their liquefied natural gas still comes from Russia.
Hmm.
They're promising to stop it. Another interesting factoid is that the idea, if you look at the public statements of the last 2 years, it appears that Europe completely stopped importing a Russian gas, natural gas. No, it's by two-thirds down, but a third still gets through. When democracies struggle with this sort of single-minded, semi-totalitarian societies, they're at a built-in disadvantage. I mean, they have to look at whether people would approve uh, higher prices at the gas station, whether
Absolutely.
whether they would set their thermostats down. Putin does not have that problem.
That's the dilemma. Well, I want to thank both of you for being with us. You've really provided important and sometimes different perspectives. So thank you very much, and we'll continue to follow both of your work. So, as we've heard, the number of sanctions against Russia and its leadership and oligarchs exceeds, imagine this, 16,000, and it continues to grow. To the surprise of many, Putin's Russia has been remarkably resistant, with an economy, while obviously not booming, remains able to fund the war in Ukraine now in its third year. Leon Aron presented a very strong case for patience, believing that the Russian state will be unable to continue to subsidize its war effort. And clearly, there needs to be more effort to stop sanction busting by countries, many of whom purport to be our allies, like India. But we will leave that discussion for another day. Thank you for watching Perspectives Matter, where we talk about things that matter with people who care.